How you guys doing? I'm going to read two selections from my novel, Wells Without Water. And just to kind of change things up, long story short, the book is about a small all-white town in Alabama during the Civil Rights era, where the mayor's daughter gives birth to a half-black baby. She's chased out of town, and the child is brought up in that town to kind of have to fend for himself. And the main character is actually the one white child in town who's willing to sacrifice everything to be his friend. But this, what I'll read today, is actually featuring neither of them. It's going to feature the therapist of the white child who grows up and ultimately ends up in Boston. Mostly because she's my favorite character, even though she's pretty far removed as a supporting role. And this is actually her speaking to her therapist. I've often wondered what would have happened if Caleb Frost had never walked into my office. Not just what would have happened to him, but what would have happened to me. I know, it's a strange thing for a therapist to wonder, but still I wonder, and I can't help but to wonder. And in truth, I don't imagine I'll ever stop wondering, even if I can. I think it's in my blood. I spent my girlhood and school years and the better part of my adult life engrossed in what-ifs. Really, it's hard not to, especially when you're that young. God, to think how I was just bombarded with the ghosts of so many future lives at that age, and then to see those ghosts retreating slowly, one by one, some of them being cursed and dared away, some being laughed at, scorned, until only the one remained, the mildest and most secure, like one of those Middle Eastern marriages where you only get to meet your spouse maybe once or twice beforehand, and even that's beside the point. It's all about how it looks on paper. My best friend Elise had a father who was rarely home because he traveled the world with one of those big fancy cameras taking vibrant pictures of ice-capped mountaintops and sea foam washing over exquisite shells on the beach and animals of every wondrous kingdom in their natural state. I must have spent hours staring at his photographs. I would just sit there, sketching out the images with colored pencils as best I could, trying to put myself in his shoes, trying to imagine it was me snapping shots of an alien landscape between the ears of some elephant I was riding. Another friend of mine had a daddy she always said was on TV. She must have told us 1,000 times before we started to mock her. Yeah, Tanya. You're full of shit, Tanya. So is my daddy. He's on the cartoon channel with all the other make-believes. Then one day she brought us into her living room and sat us right down on the couch and turned on the TV, and there he was, in a sharp gray suit, describing the weather patterns like it was nothing. Her daddy, whom we'd all seen 12 times at school functions and at home on his porch, smoking those big cigars, so we couldn't deny it was him. Daddy says he's a part of history, she said to us. And he says I'll be one too. Because when one person's already in history, he can bring anyone he wants there with him, as long as they aren't a complete nobody. And I'll be somebody, for sure. Looking back on it, it doesn't matter that Tanya got knocked up a few years later and dropped out of high school. Point is, she had a fire in her eyes. We all had it. Our futures were our own. Our futures were bright. But the future, as it turned out, at least my own, did not belong to me at all. And as I came to realize this, the fire was stifled and smothered before it ever really had a chance to give off its full light. At a certain age, I found thoughts like these, thoughts about dreams and futures and that sort of thing, they become silly and unrealistic. Then, at an age a little further down the road, they become outright ridiculous, shameful even. There's a window of time, see? And when that window closes, you're supposed to just sit there quietly with a hand on the glass and just watch the day go dark. But this isn't the way it happened with me. In my case, there was a spark. That's what it takes to get the fire going again, a spark. And as much as I want to point to Caleb Frost, I suspect it was actually a man down in Alabama named Bo Clayton who set everything in motion. Then again, it's been so long now. You can't ever really know for sure. I'm going to read one more. And this is actually a letter, or actually an email to her therapist a few years later. And it's about a story that she's telling. I read a story once when I was a bit younger about a wealthy young man, or perhaps he was a prince, who walked through the poor district of town every day on his way to the market. I can't for the life of me recall the name of the story, but it has stayed with me, and I think of it often. The man, who was very handsome, very charming, was admired and envied by all the commoners who watched him pass every day. He never strayed far from their minds or their conversations. But then there came a day when he didn't pass, and then another. And eventually the citizens learned that the man had taken his own life. And that's how the story ended. just like that, with no explanation of how the man lived or even what was troubling him. You just knew that he had chosen death over a life of splendor and prosperity, while the peasants, living in their poverty, their filth, had chosen life. God, if I could only remember the name of that wonderful story. But name or no name, the story remains, and I suspect it will continue to form an essential part of the framework through which I see the world. Which brings me to another story I wanted to talk to you about, a similar one pulled from the pages of my own life, my work at the clinic. There was this woman, well advanced in her years, who, strangely enough, had come to live in Boston from the backlands of Georgia. From the swamps, I think she told me, down along the Florida border. Her name was Mrs. Gail Parker, and she was one of the first patients I ever counseled. You can probably imagine the confusion, my shock, when I called her one day to ask why she had missed our third appointment, and instead of her feeble little voice, I heard a man on the other end, an Officer McSomething from the county sheriff's department, asking me if I had known her, and he actually used those words, "Did you know her?" Like it was already old news that she was dead. Suicide, he had told me, but that part anyone could have guessed. Mrs. Gale was a quiet woman, but she answered a question truthfully when you asked her. She was suicidal and she made no bones about it. In the first 5 minutes of our first appointment, she told me she had lost just about everyone she'd ever known, and even a few she hadn't hardly known at all, and she figured it was her time to move on as well. She said there wasn't any use in me trying to talk her out of it, and when I tried anyway, she said that I was the reason she was going to kill herself. People like me. In her own words, there's this whole new world of young folks what don't care for the say of old folks, and if that say don't hold no sort of weight, then what use there me saying anything at all? I remember that so clearly because it struck me as a prepared remark, like she had said it before, maybe more than once. She wasn't seeing me to be talked out of her decision, she said. She was seeing me so that she could do the talking. I owed her that much at least, she told me. And I think she was really referring to my generation rather than me specifically. So after that, I just shut up. For all of her plain speaking, there was a lot of mystery to her, a lot that was hard to read. You see, she wore this smile, Mrs. Gail Parker, even when confessing her sorrow. A nervous, kind of fidgety white smile with teeth that weren't really hers. And the smile itself was artificial too. And you always got the idea that something was hidden away behind it, something she refused to reveal. Maybe not a fact or a detail or anything concrete like that, but rather a sentiment, a secret emotion which she chose to hold on to keep from me. I remember it so clearly. She had fallen into an absolute existential crisis, and though you might figure someone like that would turn an uncaring eye to the superficial concerns of society, the way they look, for instance, the way they speak and carry themselves, she was still such a lady, still so modest. Embarrassed to speak of such things, she would turn away from me when talking sometimes, her face a hot, shamed red or a pale alabaster. She would laugh hysterically, would giggle, looking down at her toes. Despite my seriousness, my insistence that she give full expression to her feelings. Sometimes she would try to play it all off like she was really just joking or exaggerating, mocking things up for effect, like she didn't really mean it. But that was only her public showing, almost certainly not the way she was in private. Well, the officer practically had to hang up on me for all the questions I had for him. It turns out that when they opened the garage door and found her at peace in the old running station wagon, her body, slumped over the console, was garbed in this beautiful pleated dress, and she had spent hours making herself up. Her cheeks were blushed and powdered, and she'd done her nails and eyelids and lashes, and she'd even gone through the trouble of doing her hair up in a bouffant, like in the 60s. And her mouth. The officer said he couldn't really describe it. Sort of a smile, he said. But forced. I don't know, like maybe she wanted to make a different kind of face, but smiled instead. And in my mind, I saw that smile with perfect clarity, because I had seen it before. And I thought about it then, and I think about it still today. The last breath we all take will be out from what I hear, and I don't suspect it'll be a sound anyone's prepared to listen to. But I get the feeling sometimes that Mrs. Gail Parker's last breath was held behind that smile and never released. An inhalation, like locking away the stirrings of the deep, lest they make waves on the surface. A deep which was, to her, of lesser value, and in no way truer, more essential. A few considerations. Ray. Thank you.